Just another night, just another black teenager on the streets. But when Jaden Crawford crosses paths with two cops, everything changes. They don't ask his name. They don't give him a chance to explain. One punch and he's on the ground. But these officers have a problem. They don't know whose son they just hit. When the truth comes out, the balance of power shifts, and by the time the night is over, their lives will be divided into before and after. Jaden stared at the two white police officers in front of him. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions unreadable. The red and blue lights from their patrol car painted the street in flashing colors, making everything look surreal. He had only asked a question. That was it. "Sir, why did you stop me?" Silence. Then, a heavy hand grabbed his hoodie, yanking him forward. "Watch your mouth, boy," one of the officers snapped. Jaden barely had time to react before the first blow landed a sharp, punishing force against his stomach. Air shot from his lungs as he stumbled back, his vision blurring for a second. His hands gripped his stomach, his mind racing. What did I do? He had seen stories like this on the news, but he never thought he'd be in one. The second officer stepped closer, his baton tapping against his palm. "You think you can talk back," he said, voice low and dangerous. Jaden coughed, trying to straighten up. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. "I just asked a question," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. The officer's fist clenched. Jaden braced himself for another hit. And then, a voice. Sharp. Commanding. A name that made both officers freeze. Jaden Crawford? The moment stretched, heavy and unbreakable. The officers exchanged glances, their confident smirks faltering. Jaden swallowed hard. They knew his name. Something was about to change. Jaden's breath was still shaky as he looked at the two officers. Their faces had shifted from aggressive to uncertain in the span of a second. "Yeah," Jaden muttered, still gripping his stomach. "That's me." The officer who had hit him blinked, his baton lowering slightly. "Crawford," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. His partner stiffened beside him. Jaden saw it, the hesitation, the tiny crack in their tough guy act. "You got a problem with my name?" Jaden asked, ignoring the dull pain spreading through his ribs. The second officer's hand twitched near his belt. Not a good sign. Jaden clenched his fists. If they hit him again, he wasn't sure he'd be able to stay on his feet. Then, the first cop spoke, voice tight. "Your father, who is he?" Jaden almost laughed. So that's what this was about. They didn't know. He should have been scared. Maybe a part of him was. But right now? Right now, he felt something else. Power. "You already know the answer," Jaden said, tilting his head. "Otherwise, you wouldn't be looking at me like that." The first officer's jaw tightened. His partner took a slow step back. They knew. Or at least, they were starting to figure it out. Jaden exhaled, ignoring the pain in his gut, and took a step forward. The same way his father had taught him. "Call it in," the second cop muttered under his breath. His voice wasn't cocky anymore. Jaden smirked, despite everything. "Yeah, call it in. Let's see what happens." He watched as the officer hesitated, hand hovering over his radio. He wasn't so sure anymore. Because FBI agents don't take it lightly when their sons are assaulted by cops. And Jaden? Jaden was about to make sure they knew exactly whose son he was. Jaden stood his ground, chest rising and falling as he tried to steady his breathing. His stomach still throbbed from the punch, but he forced himself to focus. Something had changed. The officers no longer looked confident. Their postures had stiffened, and their hands hovered near their belts, not quite reaching for their weapons, but close enough to show that they were on edge. One of them, the one who had hit him, squinted at Jaden. "What did you just say?" Jaden swallowed the ache in his throat and straightened his back. "You already know," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. The officers exchanged a quick glance. That was all Jaden needed to see. They were unsure now. Afraid. For the first time that night, they didn't feel in control anymore. "Who's your father?" the second officer asked. His tone had changed, less aggressive, more cautious. Jaden tilted his head slightly. "You want to take a wild guess?" The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The first officer's mouth twitched, his fingers tightening into fists. "What kind of game do you think you're playing, kid?" Jaden let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, I'm not playing." He nodded toward the radio clipped to the officer's vest. "But you might want to make a call. Find out exactly whose kid you just put your hands on." A flicker of hesitation crossed the officer's face. Jaden could see it now, the moment it clicked. Crawford. They recognized the name. One of them took a half step back. His partner shot him a glare, but even he was starting to look uneasy. "You're lying," the first officer muttered, but there was no real confidence in his voice. Jaden smirked. "Try me." The officer hesitated for a second before yanking his radio up to his mouth. "Dispatch, I need a," he paused, inhaling sharply. "I need a name check on a Jaden Crawford." Jaden crossed his arms. "Here we go." The response came almost immediately. A static crackle. Then, "Unit 47, confirm, did you say Crawford?" The two officers stiffened. "Yeah," the officer muttered. "Jaden Crawford." A beat of silence. Then the dispatcher's voice came back, sharper, more alert. "As in Michael Crawford? FBI?" Neither officer spoke. Jaden did. "That's the one." The first officer's jaw clenched. The second one swallowed hard. They both knew exactly what that meant. Jaden watched as they processed it, watched the wheels turning in their heads as they realized how badly they had screwed up. The officer who had punched him looked like he wanted to take it back, to rewind time and pretend none of this had happened. But it was too late. Jaden could practically hear the thoughts racing in their heads. "We hit the son of an FBI agent. We used force without cause. There's a recording. This won't disappear." The second officer licked his lips and spoke first. His voice wasn't as steady as before. "Look, maybe this is a..." Jaden held up a hand, cutting him off. "A misunderstanding?" The first officer tensed. Jaden took a step closer. "You didn't ask for my name. You didn't check if I did anything wrong. You just saw a black kid in a hoodie and decided to act." The silence that followed was the loudest sound of the night. Jaden let it stretch before leaning in just slightly, lowering his voice. "And now you're realizing that wasn't the smartest move, huh?" The first officer's hand twitched at his side. He hated this. Hated that the kid he had just hit was now the one in control. Jaden could see it all over his face. But he couldn't take it back. The radio crackled again. "Unit 47, do you require assistance?" The officer hesitated. Then, in a voice that was too forced, too shaky, he answered, "Negative. We're clear." Jaden raised an eyebrow. "Clear?" The second officer shot his partner a look, but it wasn't the same smug confidence they had before. It was desperation. They wanted this to go away. Jaden pulled out his phone, the screen still glowing. He tapped it once. The red recording icon blinked. They saw it. The second officer exhaled through his nose. "Look, kid, maybe we just..." Jaden gave him a slow, knowing nod. "You want me to forget this, don't you?" Neither of them answered. But Jaden already knew the truth. They were terrified. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of what came next. And Jaden was going to make sure they never forgot this night for the rest of their lives. Jaden stood in the dim glow of the streetlights, his body still aching, but his mind sharper than ever. The cops had frozen. Not physically, they were still there, still standing in front of him, but something inside them had snapped. They had started the night in control. Now, they weren't sure what to do. Jaden could feel it. The shift in power. The way the air had changed around them. For the first time, they were the ones who didn't have the right words. The second officer, his hand still hovering near his belt, cleared his throat. "Listen, kid." Jaden cut him off. "Stop calling me that." The officer blinked. Jaden took a step forward, ignoring the pain still pulsing through his ribs. "You don't get to talk down to me anymore." Another pause. Then, the first officer spoke. "We don't want any trouble." Jaden actually laughed. "Short. Cold. Sharp. You should have thought about that before you threw the first punch." The officer clenched his jaw. "It was a..." Jaden tilted his head. "A mistake?" No one spoke. Because the truth was already out in the open. And now, they were just trying to survive it. The radio crackled again, the voice of dispatch cutting through the silence. "Unit 47, confirm your status." Jaden didn't move. He waited. The officers hesitated just for a second, but that second was enough to tell him everything. They didn't know what to say. Because if they answered truthfully, if they said the wrong thing, this could escalate beyond anything they could control. Jaden saw it all happening in their minds. They had assaulted a kid. That kid was the son of a federal agent. And that kid was recording them. The first officer finally raised his radio, but Jaden could see the sweat forming at his temple. "We're clear," he muttered. A beat of silence. Then dispatch responded. "Copy that. Returning to normal operations." Jaden felt something cold settle in his stomach. They were trying to bury this. Just like that. Like it had never happened. Like he was supposed to just walk away. Jaden shook his head slowly. "That's it?" The officer exhaled sharply. "What do you want, kid?" Jaden let the words roll around in his mind. What did he want? To be honest, he hadn't thought that far ahead. The whole night had been reacting. Running. Stumbling. Getting hit. Pushing back. But now? Now he was standing in front of two cops who had already lost. And he got to decide how this ended. His fingers tightened around his phone. "I want you to remember this," he said finally, his voice steady. "Every single time you put your hands on someone who looks like me." The officer opened his mouth, but Jaden kept going. "I want you to remember this moment when you realized you weren't untouchable." He took another step forward. "And I want you to think about what happens next." The second officer's breathing was shallow. He wasn't speaking anymore. Just waiting. Watching. They wanted to get out of this. But it wasn't that simple. Jaden raised his phone slightly. "See, I could post this right now." The first officer flinched. "But I won't," Jaden said. "Not yet." The officers exchanged a glance, their shoulders still tense. "But I will make a call." He tapped his phone. His thumb hovered over one name. Michael Crawford. And just like that, the fear returned to their eyes. They didn't know his father. Not personally. But they had heard of him. An FBI agent with a reputation. A man who didn't let things go. A man who didn't tolerate this kind of bullshit. Jaden smirked. "You already know what happens when I press this button, don't you?" Neither officer responded. They didn't need to. Jaden let the moment drag out, let them sweat for a few more seconds. Then, finally, he tapped the screen. The phone rang once. Twice. Then. A voice. Sharp. Controlled. "Jaden." Jaden exhaled, still holding eye contact with the officers. "Dad," he said simply. Silence. Then, in a tone that was almost too calm, his father asked, "What happened?" Jaden could see the officers barely breathing. He smiled. Just a little. I'll let you hear it for yourself. And with that, he pressed play. The recording of the assault. The punch. The voices. The arrogance. Every single detail, playing out through the speaker of his phone. Jaden's father didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions. He just listened. When it was over, his voice came through again, low, steady, but dangerous. Where are you right now? Jaden gave him the street name. He saw the officers flinch. I'll be there in 10 minutes, his father said. Then, after a pause. Don't move. Click. The call ended. Jaden slid his phone back into his pocket. And then, for the first time tonight, he watched two police officers feel what he had felt earlier. Powerless. They had started the night thinking they were untouchable. And now, they were about to learn the truth. Jaden watched as the officer clipped the radio back onto his vest, avoiding his gaze. The streetlights above buzzed, casting long shadows over the scene. The fear in their eyes was obvious now. They knew they had screwed up. And Jaden wasn't going to let them forget it. You think this is over? He asked, tilting his head slightly. The second officer, the one who had hit him, finally spoke, his voice lower, more controlled, but still tense. Listen, kid, you don't want to make this harder than it has to be. Jaden let out a dry laugh. Harder? For who? Me, or you? Neither of them answered. Jaden took another step forward. He wanted them to feel what he had felt when they put their hands on him. That helplessness, that cold realization that he could have been just another name on the news tonight. But he wasn't. Because unlike so many others, Jaden had a weapon they didn't expect. His name. My dad's gonna love this story, he said casually, watching their expressions shift again. Panic. The first officer finally broke. Look, let's just forget this happened. His voice was tight, controlled, like he was barely holding back his own frustration. Jaden let the words hang in the air for a second. Forget? His stomach still throbbed from the punch. His pride still burned from the way they had looked at him before they knew his name. He wasn't going to forget. And neither were they. Sorry, Jaden said, flashing a smirk. I don't think I can do that. The officer's nostrils flared, his hands balling into fists. He hated this. Hated that the power had shifted. Jaden took out his phone and held it up between them. Smile for the camera. They didn't move. Jaden tapped the screen, recording their faces, their badges, the nervous tension between them. You can go now, he said, still holding the phone up. Neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, the first officer turned, muttering something under his breath before heading back to the patrol car. His partner hesitated for a moment, looking at Jaden like he wanted to say something, but then thought better of it. Jaden didn't look away as they got into the car. The engine roared to life. They drove off. Jaden stood there for a long moment, the night air cool against his skin. His breath was still uneven, his hands still shaking slightly. But one thought cut through everything. This wasn't over. Not for them. Not for him. Jaden watched the officers shift uncomfortably. They didn't know what to do with their hands, their feet, or even their expressions. They had spent their whole careers in control. But not tonight. Tonight, they were the ones being watched. Judged. Trapped. Jaden knew that feeling well. It was the same one he'd felt when they put their hands on him. The same one that black kids had been feeling for generations. Except now? Now it was their turn. The first officer cleared his throat, his eyes flickering toward his partner. Jaden could see it, he wanted to run. But he couldn't. Because no matter how badly they wanted this moment to disappear, there was no escaping it. Jaden's father was on his way. And the Crawford name wasn't something you could just shake off. You don't have to do this, the second officer finally said. Jaden blinked. He actually laughed. Don't have to do what? The officer shifted his weight. You got no real injuries. You're standing here, right? No harm, no foul. Jaden's smirk disappeared instantly. No harm? His voice was dangerously low now. That's what you're going with? The officer exhaled sharply. Listen, Jaden took a step forward. You didn't even ask my name before you put your hands on me. His voice was steady, but every word carried weight. And now you want me to act like it never happened? Neither of them answered. Jaden let out a dry laugh. Would you be saying the same thing if my dad wasn't FBI? Still nothing. He nodded slowly. Yeah. That's what I thought. The officers exchanged another look. Jaden could see the panic creeping back in. They weren't used to being questioned. They weren't used to losing. And they definitely weren't used to someone like him being the one in charge. A car engine roared in the distance. Not just any car. Jaden knew that sound. The deep, controlled purr of an expensive, government-issued SUV. The officers heard it too. And they flinched. That was the moment Jaden realized something. They already knew who his father was. Not just from the radio call. Not just from the name. They had heard about him before. And they were terrified. Jaden didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just let them feel that waiting. That slow, suffocating fear of what was about to happen. The black SUV rolled up smoothly, headlights cutting through the dim glow of the streetlights. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. The mere presence of it was enough to make the officers take a step back. The driver's side door opened. And out stepped Michael Crawford. Jaden had seen his father in many moods before. But this? This was different. His movements were slow. Controlled. Predatory. His suit was crisp, his posture perfect. And his eyes? His eyes were locked onto the two men who had touched his son. The air changed immediately. Even though no words had been spoken yet, everyone already knew how this night was going to end. Michael Crawford stopped just a few feet away from Jaden, his gaze sweeping over him. A quick scan. Assessing. Checking for injuries. When he saw Jaden was standing, saw that he was okay, for the most part, he gave a small nod. Then, he turned his full attention to the officers. The first one, the one who had hit Jaden, looked like he wanted to shrink into himself. But there was nowhere to go. Michael's voice was calm. Too calm. Who put their hands on my son? Neither officer spoke. Michael blinked once. Then, his voice dropped even lower. That wasn't a rhetorical question. The second officer, the one who had spoken earlier, cleared his throat. This isn't what it looks like, sir, he said quickly. Michael tilted his head slightly. Isn't it? The officer's throat bobbed. We thought he was someone else. Michael exhaled slowly. Then, he nodded. Good. The officers blinked in confusion. Michael took another step forward. Then when Internal Affairs reviews this case, and you won't have a problem explaining exactly why you mistook my son for someone else. Silence. The officers had no response. Because there wasn't one. They both knew exactly why they had singled Jaden out. And so did Michael. Michael turned slightly, glancing at Jaden. You got the recording? Jaden didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen, letting the video play again. The hit. The words. The smugness in their voices before they realized who he was. Michael listened without emotion. When it ended, he nodded once. Save that. Jaden smirked. Already did. Michael turned back to the officers. You have two options, he said smoothly. Neither of them moved. 1. You walk into your precinct first thing in the morning and turn in your resignations. The first officer's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Or 2, Michael continued, stepping even closer, lowering his voice to a razor-thin whisper, you wait until Internal Affairs pulls your files, drags your records, and finds out what I already know. The officers stiffened. Jayden raised an eyebrow. What did his dad know? Michael took out his own phone, scrolling through something. Then, he smirked. Just barely. You didn't think I walked into this blind, did you? He asked. Jayden had never seen two grown men look more afraid in his life. And he was enjoying every second of it. Jayden leaned back, watching the officers struggle to process how fast their world had flipped upside down. 10 minutes ago, they were untouchable. Now they were just two men standing in front of someone they never should have messed with. Michael exhaled, glancing at his watch. You have until morning, he said simply. If I don't see your resignations by noon, he tapped his phone. I make some calls. He didn't need to say more. Jayden watched as the first officer swallowed hard. The second officer nodded stiffly. They understood. They had lost. Jayden smiled. This wasn't just justice. This was a warning. And these two? They'd never forget it. Jayden stood on the empty street, his phone still in his hand, the red recording light blinking. The taillights of the police cruiser disappeared around the corner, but their faces, the fear in their eyes, stayed burned in his mind. He exhaled slowly and tapped his phone screen. Saved. Now, there was only one thing left to do. He pressed a number he had memorized since he was a kid. It rang twice before a voice answered, calm but sharp. Jayden? He felt his chest tighten. Dad. Silence. But not the kind that meant nothing. The kind that meant everything. What happened? His father asked, his voice suddenly colder, sharper. Jayden hesitated. He wanted to say, I'm fine. It's nothing. But that wasn't the truth. They stopped me, he said finally. Didn't even ask for my name. One of them hit me. The silence stretched. Then, his father spoke again. This time, his voice was different. Deadly calm. Where are you? Jayden gave him the cross streets. He heard movement on the other end of the line. His dad was already grabbing his keys, already putting on his jacket. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said. Then, after a beat. Did you record it? Jayden glanced down at his phone screen. Yeah. His father's exhale was slow, measured. Good. The call ended. Jayden tucked his phone into his pocket, his fingers still gripping it tightly. 10 minutes. That was all he had to wait. But for those two cops? Their waiting was just beginning. Jayden sat in the passenger seat of his father's SUV, staring out the window as the city blurred past. His phone sat heavy in his lap. The recording was still there. The proof. The night wasn't over. Not yet. Michael Crawford drove without speaking at first, but the energy in the car was anything but silent. His grip on the wheel was controlled, his jaw tight. Jayden had seen his father mad before. But this? This was different. It wasn't rage. It wasn't shouting. It was calculation. His father was planning. Finally, Jayden broke the silence. So what happens now? Michael didn't look away from the road. First, we make some calls. Jayden glanced down at his phone. I already have the video saved. His father nodded. Good. Then, after a beat, he added, but we're not just going after two officers. Jayden frowned. We're not? Michael's fingers tapped the steering wheel, thoughtful. Jayden, this isn't just about those two. This is about the system that made them think they could get away with it. Jayden let that sink in. Because deep down, he knew his father was right. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't just one bad cop. It wasn't just one bad night. It was bigger. And his father was about to prove it. Michael reached for his phone, pressed a button on his dashboard, and the car's speaker clicked. A ringing tone filled the SUV. 1, 2, 3. Then, a voice. Gruff. Alert. Tired. Who the hell is calling me this late? Michael's tone didn't shift. Wake up, Jim. We have a problem. Jayden blinked. Jim? Then he realized Jim Reynolds. The police captain. The voice on the other end of the line sighed. Damn it, Crawford. You better not be bringing me more headaches. Michael's grip on the wheel didn't change. Oh, I'm bringing you more than that. A pause. Jayden could hear sheets rustling. The captain was sitting up now. Talk. Michael's voice was smooth. Calculated. A predator speaking to another predator. 2 of your officers assaulted my son tonight. I have the video. Silence. Not the casual kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that meant somebody just realized they were in deep, deep trouble. When the captain finally spoke again, his voice was carefully measured. That's a big accusation, Crawford. Michael's smirk was almost audible. It's not an accusation. It's a fact. And you're going to see it for yourself. Jayden watched as his father tapped his phone screen once, sending the recording straight to the captain. There was a soft chime on the other end of the call. A file received. The captain was watching it now. Jayden could hear his breathing. Slow. Heavy. Then, sharper. Jesus. Michael waited. The captain exhaled. Who were they? Michael didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he said, I want their records. The captain hesitated. I can't just. You can, Michael interrupted. And you will. Unless you want me to go to the press first. Silence. Jayden's heart pounded. This was it. The moment when the entire game shifted. The captain sighed again, but this time it was defeated. Fine. I'll get you what you need. Michael leaned back slightly, satisfied. Good. You have until morning. Click. The call ended. Jayden let out a slow breath. His father just blackmailed a police captain. And won. But the night wasn't over. Not yet. Michael didn't even pause before dialing another number. Jayden raised an eyebrow. Who's next? His father smirked. The Attorney General. Jayden's eyes widened. You're serious? Michael gave him a side glance. Do I look like I'm joking? Jayden sat back. This was bigger than he thought. The line rang 3 times before a clipped, professional voice answered. Crawford. To what do I owe the pleasure? Michael's voice was smooth as ice. I have a case for you. Jayden listened as his father laid it all out, the stop, the assault, the video. But this time, he went even further. These 2 officers aren't clean, Michael continued. I want a full investigation. The voice on the other end hummed. You think they've done this before? Michael's smirk was razor sharp. I know they have. Jayden frowned. How do you know that? Michael didn't take his eyes off the road. Because people like that never start with just one. A chill ran down Jayden's spine. His father was right. And if they dug deep enough, they'd find more victims. This wasn't just about him anymore. The Attorney General agreed to open a case. Michael ended the call, nodding slightly. Jayden exhaled. So, that's it? Michael shot him a look. Oh, no. We're just getting started. Jayden raised an eyebrow. What else is there? Michael pulled into their driveway, shut off the car, and finally turned to look at his son fully. Tomorrow morning, we let the city know exactly who these men are. Jayden blinked. Like, a press conference? Michael smirked. Better. He tapped his phone again. I already sent the video to 3 reporters. Jayden's stomach flipped. You wait, what? Michael opened his door. Go get some sleep, Jayden. Jayden sat there, stunned. Dad, you just. Michael leaned into the car, smirking slightly. Tomorrow morning, their names will be everywhere. And by noon, they won't just be fired. His smirk widened slightly. They'll never wear a badge again. Jayden didn't move. Because for the first time that night, he realized something. This wasn't just justice. This was revenge. And his father? He was really, really good at it. The street was quiet. Too quiet. Jayden paced back and forth, his fists clenching and unclenching. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the pain in his stomach was settling in. But he didn't care. He heard it before he saw it, a deep, rumbling engine cutting through the silence. Headlights swept across the pavement as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Jayden stopped. His heartbeat picked up again, but this time, not from fear. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a man who commanded the space around him without saying a word. Michael Crawford. Jayden's father. Dressed in a crisp black suit, his FBI badge clipped to his belt, he moved like a storm rolling in. Slow. Controlled. Dangerous. His eyes locked onto Jayden immediately, scanning him from head to toe. His gaze lingered on the spot where Jayden had been hit. Then, he spoke. Who did it? Jayden swallowed. His dad's voice was low, even, but lethal. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. The video popped up, and he held it out. His father watched in silence as the footage played, the punch, the way Jayden had doubled over, the officer's smug expressions before they knew who he was. Jayden had seen his father angry before. But this? This was different. Michael Crawford's jaw tightened. His hand flexed at his side. Then, without a word, he turned and got back into the SUV. Jayden blinked. Dad? His father didn't look at him as he grabbed his phone from the center console and started making a call. Jayden stepped closer, catching only a few words of the conversation. I want names. Now. A pause. No, I don't care what time it is. Get me the precinct captain. Wake him up if you have to. Another pause. Then, cold and final. Those two are done. Jayden felt something shift in the air. This was the moment. The before and after. For those cops, their lives had just changed forever. Jayden's father ended the call and finally turned back to him. His voice softened, just barely. You okay? Jayden hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Michael studied him for a long second, as if deciding whether or not to believe him. Then he gave a short nod and gestured to the passenger seat. Get in. Jayden didn't argue. He climbed in, buckling his seatbelt as his father started the engine. As they pulled away from the curb, Jayden glanced at him. What happens now? His father's grip on the wheel tightened. His eyes stayed on the road, but his voice was filled with quiet certainty. Now, he said. Now we make sure they remember this night for the rest of their lives. Jayden woke up to the sound of his phone vibrating nonstop on his nightstand. At first, he ignored it. His body still ached from the hit he'd taken the night before, and his mind was groggy from only a few hours of sleep. But when he cracked his eyes open and saw the endless flood of notifications, his heart kicked into high gear. News alerts. Messages. Missed calls. Something had happened. Something big. He reached for his phone and unlocked it. And there it was. The first headline. Police officers under investigation for assaulting FBI agent's son. Jayden's breath caught in his throat. The next headline: bodycam footage suspiciously missing, but victim recorded everything. And another: who are officers Thompson and Graves? A deep dive into their history. Jaden sat up so fast he nearly dropped his phone. It was everywhere. His father had said it would happen. And now, the entire city was watching. Jaden rushed downstairs, his heart still pounding. He expected his father to be on the phone, to be in full crisis mode. Instead, Michael Crawford sat at the kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee like it was just another Tuesday. Jaden blinked. "Dad, have you seen?" Michael didn't look up. "The news?" "Of course." Jaden frowned. "And you're just having coffee?" Michael finally glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "What would you like me to do? Panic?" Jaden opened his mouth, then closed it. Because the truth was, his father never panicked. Michael leaned back slightly, setting his mug down. "This is exactly what needed to happen, Jaden." Jaden's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. This time, it was a video. A live press conference. He tapped it, and the screen filled with a shaky camera feed of a man in a police uniform standing in front of a swarm of reporters. Jaden's stomach flipped. The police chief. He turned the volume up just in time to hear the chief's shaky voice. "We take allegations like these very seriously, and I want to assure the public that an internal investigation has been launched." Jaden narrowed his eyes. Lies. He glanced at his father. "Are they really investigating?" Michael chuckled. "No." Jaden clenched his jaw. "Then what are they doing?" Michael took another slow sip of coffee. "Trying to save their own asses." As if on cue, a loud knock echoed from the front door. Jaden's heart jumped into his throat. Michael, however, didn't flinch. He simply set his mug down, stood up, and walked calmly to the door. He opened it. Standing outside were three men in dark suits, badges clipped to their belts. FBI agents. Jaden froze. He had expected this moment, but actually seeing it happen? That was something else. The man in the center, a tall figure with graying hair, gave a tight nod. "Crawford." Michael nodded back. "Reynolds." Jaden's breath hitched. Jim Reynolds, the head of the FBI's Internal Affairs Division. And if he was here? That meant things had escalated way beyond two rogue cops. Reynolds stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. His two agents followed. Jaden glanced at his father, waiting for some kind of cue. Michael simply shut the door and gestured toward the living room. "Let's talk." Jaden sat on the couch, gripping his phone as the three FBI agents settled in. Reynolds got straight to the point. "We've reviewed the footage." Jaden's stomach twisted. "And?" Reynolds exhaled. "It's bad." Jaden clenched his fists. "Yeah, no kidding." Michael remained calm. "How bad?" Reynolds reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Thick. Heavy. He slid it across the table. Michael picked it up and flipped through it, his expression unreadable. Jaden, however, leaned forward, heart pounding. "What's in there?" Reynolds met his gaze. "A pattern." Jaden frowned. "A pattern?" Reynolds nodded. "Those two officers? Thompson and Graves? This isn't their first complaint." Jaden's blood ran cold. "How many?" Reynolds hesitated. Michael answered for him. 12. Jaden felt like he'd been punched in the stomach all over again. 12? His voice came out hoarse. "And they're still on the force?" Reynolds exhaled. "For now." Michael's voice was low, firm. "Not for much longer." Reynolds leaned forward, his tone serious. "We're going to push for immediate suspension. If we can prove intent, they'll face criminal charges." Jaden felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, satisfaction, anger. But mostly, determination. Michael studied Reynolds carefully. And the department? Reynolds's expression hardened. They'll try to sweep it under the rug. But with the video out? The press breathing down their necks? He smirked slightly. They don't have a choice but to cooperate. Jaden exhaled. This was really happening. For the first time, corrupt cops weren't getting away with it. And he was the reason why. Reynolds stood up, nodding once to Michael. We'll be in touch. Michael nodded back. I'll expect updates. Reynolds gave Jaden a long look before stepping toward the door. Then, right before leaving, he added, "You did the right thing, kid." Jaden swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to say. So he just nodded. The agents left. The door clicked shut behind them. Jaden exhaled, leaning back against the couch. That was insane. Michael smirked. You haven't seen anything yet. Jaden frowned. What do you mean? His father picked up his phone and scrolled for a second. Then, he turned the screen toward Jaden. It was a new headline. FBI launches full investigation into police department. Jaden's eyes widened. Wait, they're investigating the whole department? Michael nodded. This isn't just about 2 officers anymore, Jaden. Jaden stared at the screen. He had started the night just trying to survive. Now he had just set off a bomb. And the people who had spent years getting away with it? They were finally about to burn. The ride was silent, but the air inside the SUV was thick with tension. Jaden glanced at his father, who had one hand on the wheel and the other resting near his phone, as if waiting for it to ring. Jaden had never seen him like this, not just angry, but focused. Calculating. They pulled up to a tall government building downtown. His father parked in a reserved spot, turned off the engine, and finally looked at Jaden. Come inside. Jaden followed without a word. He didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but he knew one thing: this wasn't just going away. Inside, the office was dimly lit, nearly empty. Only a few people in suits moved through the halls, their eyes widening slightly when they saw Michael Crawford walking in with his son. Jaden's father didn't stop until they reached a private meeting room. He opened the door, and inside sat 3 men. FBI agents. They looked up, their expressions unreadable. But Jaden saw the recognition in their eyes. They already knew. Michael took a seat, nodding for Jaden to do the same. Then, without hesitation, he slid Jaden's phone across the table. Play it, he said. Jaden's heart pounded as he pressed play. The room was silent as the footage played, the sound of the officer's voice, the sharp impact of the punch, Jaden's staggered breath. When it ended, no one spoke for a long moment. Then, one of the agents, a man with graying hair and sharp eyes, exhaled. Jesus Christ. Michael leaned forward, his voice controlled but firm. I want everything on them. Full records. Complaints, disciplinary history, anything that shows this isn't the first time. The agent hesitated. And if it is? Michael's eyes darkened. Then it's the last. Jaden swallowed. This was bigger than he thought. His father wasn't just going after those cops. He was making a point. One of the agents nodded, already typing something on his laptop. I'll pull their files now. Another agent frowned. And after that? Michael didn't even blink. They're finished. Jaden watched as the men exchanged glances, silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about justice. It was about making sure this never happened again. The first agent nodded. We'll handle it. Michael stood, motioning for Jaden to follow. As they stepped out into the hallway, his father finally looked at him again. You did the right thing, he said. Jaden wasn't sure if it felt like that yet. But when he looked at his father, saw the way he had taken control, the way those men had listened, he knew one thing for sure. Those officers had messed with the wrong kid. And they were about to find out exactly what that meant. 2 days later, it was all over the news. Jaden sat at the kitchen table, his phone buzzing nonstop with notifications. His dad had already turned off the TV after the 5th news segment covering it, but the headlines were still burned into Jaden's mind. 2 officers under investigation for excessive force. FBI agent's son assaulted, Internal Affairs launches full inquiry. Body cam footage missing, cover-up suspected. That last one made Jaden smirk. Of course, they lost the footage. Too bad he had his own. His father walked in, coffee in hand, his suit crisp as always. But something in his posture was different, relaxed. Satisfied. Jaden glanced up at him. It worked, didn't it? Michael took a sip of his coffee, then nodded. They're done. Both of them. Jaden's stomach twisted, not with fear, but with something else. Relief. Justice. Power. They lose their jobs? He asked. Michael shook his head. Not yet. But they're suspended while the investigation is open. Once Internal Affairs is done, they won't be wearing a badge again. Jaden leaned back in his chair, exhaling. It was surreal. 2 nights ago, he thought he might end up in a hospital or worse. And now? Now those officers were the ones fighting to keep their lives from falling apart. Michael sat across from him, setting his coffee down. He studied Jaden for a moment before speaking. This won't be the last time something like this happens, he said. His voice was calm but firm. Serious. Jaden met his gaze. I know. His father nodded. Good. He took another sip of his coffee before adding, next time, you record from the start. Jaden chuckled. Next time, I won't get hit. Michael smirked, just a little. That's my boy. Jaden picked up his phone again, scrolling through the news, through the texts from his friends who had seen the story. It was everywhere now. And those cops? They weren't just suspended. They were a warning. Jaden knew this wasn't the end of the fight. But now, he also knew something else. Next time, they wouldn't just see a black kid on the street. They'd see Crawford. And they'd think twice.